You step onto a train packed with 300 people, and you have never felt more alone. You know nobody's name. Nobody asks yours. Every face is 6 inches from your face, and somehow you have never felt more invisible. That feeling has a name. Researchers call it the familiar stranger effect, and the real reason it happens is far stranger than simple shyness. Your brain isn't broken. It isn't antisocial. It's running code that was written for a world that hasn't existed in 10,000 years. For almost all of human history, you never saw 300 faces in a single day. You saw the same 40 or 50 over and over for your entire life. The same mother, the same cousins, the same hunters returning at dusk. Every face carried a story your brain had already memorized. So what happens when you flood that ancient system with strangers? It doesn't relax. It doesn't shut off. It keeps scanning, keeps cataloging, keeps trying to do the one job it has always done. And it fails quietly, hundreds of times a day. The anthropologist Robin Dunbar spent decades studying primate brains and human social groups, and he found something remarkable. The size of your social circle isn't a personal choice. It's a biological limit, set by the size of a part of your brain called the neocortex. Across hunter-gatherer societies, military companies, even online communities, the number kept appearing. Around 150 people. That's the rough ceiling on how many relationships your brain can meaningfully track at once. Who owes you a favor? Who you trust? Who you'd fight beside? 150. That was your entire world for 200,000 years. Now picture your commute. In 15 minutes, you pass more faces than your ancestors saw in a season. Your brain tries anyway. It tags each one just for a second. The same way it would have tagged a stranger wandering into the village. Threat or no threat? Kin or no kin? Then the train stops, the doors open, and the face is gone forever. Multiply that by every day of your life in a city, and something strange starts to happen. In 1972, the psychologist Stanley Milgram noticed it too. He photographed commuters at a New York train station and showed the pictures back to other commuters. The results were almost eerie. People recognized dozens of faces. They had seen these strangers, sometimes for years, standing in the same spot every morning. But almost none of them had ever spoken a single word to them. Milgram called these people familiar strangers, and he argued they represent a completely new category of relationship. One your ancestors never had to invent, because it never existed before cities did. A familiar stranger isn't a friend, but it isn't quite a stranger either. Your brain knows the face. It has filed it under safe, under recognized, under not a threat. But it has nowhere to file the rest. No name, no story, no bond. So it just sits there, flagged but empty, an open file your mind can never close. Here's the part that should change how you think about loneliness entirely. You'd assume that feeling isolated in a crowd means your social instincts have failed. They haven't. They're working exactly as designed. The ache you feel on that train isn't a malfunction. It's an alarm. The neuroscientist John Cacioppo spent his career studying loneliness, and what he found upended the old assumption that it was simply sadness or shyness or a personality flaw. Loneliness, in his research, behaves like physical pain. It activates the same regions of the brain that respond to a cut on your skin. It raises cortisol. It disrupts sleep. It does this because, for nearly your entire evolutionary history, isolation meant death. A human alone on the savannah didn't survive the night. So your body built an alarm system precise enough to fire the instant you sense you're disconnected. Even when you're standing shoulder to shoulder with 300 people, that's the twist. The crowd doesn't silence the alarm, it triggers it louder, because your brain isn't counting bodies, it's counting bonds. And on a crowded train, surrounded by familiar strangers, the bond count reads 0. So why does it feel worse here than walking alone through an empty field? Because an empty field never promised connection. A crowd does. Every face nearby is a face your ancestral brain assumes should mean something. Should be kin, should be tribe, should be safe in the deepest sense. When none of them are, the gap between expectation and reality is exactly what produces that hollow, exposed feeling. Not the absence of people, the absence of belonging in the presence of people. This is where the modern world quietly multiplies the problem. Your ancestors had roughly 150 relationships and almost no familiar strangers. You now have, by some estimates, a few dozen real relationships and thousands of familiar strangers. Co-workers in other departments, neighbors you wave at, faces from your feed you'd recognize on the street but couldn't name. The ratio has flipped completely. Weak, unfinished connections have crowded out the strong ones your brain actually needs to feel safe. Social media didn't invent this, it just turned the dial to its limit. You can now scroll past hundreds of familiar strangers in the time it takes to drink your coffee. Never speaking, never bonding, just tagging, filing, moving on. The alarm doesn't go off all at once. It builds quietly in the background, the way a single recurring debt builds into something heavier than it ever felt at the start. So, what do you actually do with this? You won't fix it by avoiding crowds, and you won't fix it by collecting more familiar strangers. The research points somewhere more specific. Dunbar's data suggests it isn't the number of people around you that matters. It's the number of closed loops. A closed loop is a relationship that has moved from filed but empty to actually known. A name attached to the face, a story attached to the name. Even one new closed loop a week does something 1,000 familiar strangers never can. Because it's the only currency your ancient social brain actually recognizes. That barista who's made your coffee for 2 years and still doesn't know your name. That's an open loop. Ask, close it. Your brain has been waiting on that file for longer than you realized. Think about your commute differently now. Every face in that crowd is running the same ancient program you are. Each one is scanning, filing, quietly aching in exactly the same way, for exactly the same evolutionary reason. The loneliness on that train was never really about being surrounded by strangers. It was about how many of them were never given the chance to stop being strangers at all. You step onto a train packed with 300 people, and for the first time, you understand exactly why being surrounded was never the same thing as being known.